Have you ever wondered why U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, specifically toward Venezuela, could completely change the way we look at the global rivalry brewing between the United States and China?
Yeah, that's really the critical lens for today, isn't it? What we're digging into isn't just some regional spat. It's about this intense, often kind of hidden conflict in Venezuela.
Right.
And our analysis suggests it's absolutely central to this whole emerging new Cold War dynamic.
And it gets pretty shocking, fast. I mean, right at the heart of it, you've got a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Maria Corina Machado.
Hmm.
And she's been actively lobbying, apparently, for the U.S. military to intervene in her own country. Her goal, pretty openly stated, is to overthrow the government, take power, and then, well, privatize Venezuela's enormous oil reserves.
Selling them off, essentially, to U.S. and Western companies.
Exactly. So our mission here is to really unpack why Venezuela is such a target. We need to connect the dots between its history, that immense oil wealth, and crucially, its alliances with players like China, Russia, and Iran.
Okay, so if we start with the U.S. strategic view, it's laid out pretty clearly. China is the main target, the long-term competitor.
Seen as a bigger challenge than the Soviets ever were.
In many ways, yes. Because it's not just military, right? It's economic, it's technological, it challenges U.S. dominance across the board.
Okay, so how does that big picture strategy connect down to Latin America? Because it sounds like the region gets a whole new level of importance.
It does. The thinking seems to be, first, consolidate U.S. influence, hegemony, really, over the entire Western Hemisphere. Secure the home base, so to speak.
Before projecting power elsewhere, like the Pacific.
Precisely. Before focusing heavily on the West Pacific to counter Beijing. And that means, other regions maybe get less focus. Europe, Africa, Latin America becomes foundational.
That shift really explains the pressure then. And connecting it to the economics, well, you see why isolating Beijing there is key. China's now the biggest trading partner for most of South America,
Yeah.
in fact, Mexico being the exception.
Yeah, that trade has exploded, while U.S. economic clout, relatively speaking, has been shrinking a bit in the region.
And Venezuela is like ground zero for this competition. It just recently upgraded its relationship with China to an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. That sounds significant.
It's huge. That term signals the absolute deepest level of diplomatic and military closeness. China previously only used that for, Pakistan. So this isn't just about trade deals.
No, it's a serious strategic alignment, directly challenging that U.S. goal of consolidating the hemisphere.
And the prize underneath all this, it really boils down to two things: resources and sovereignty. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet.
And history plays a huge role here too, doesn't it? With
Yeah.
Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution.
Absolutely. Back in 1998, Chavez, inspired by Simón Bolívar the Liberator, nationalized the oil industry, kicked out the big Western oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell.
And use that oil money for social programs.
Massive programs, housing, healthcare, education. So when you put that history next to what Machado is saying now,
The U.S. goal seems pretty clear. Regain control over those resources. And the pressure isn't just on Venezuela, is it? You mentioned a regional strategy.
right, look at Argentina, a huge U.S. bailout, $40 billion. But sources indicate that money came with strings attached.
What kind of strings?
Basically, conditions that Argentina had to slow down, maybe even cut its growing ties and infrastructure projects with China. It shows the playbook: financial help if you play along, crippling pressure if you don't.
And when the financial incentives don't work, the sanctions come out. That pressure on Venezuela ramped up significantly. It actually started earlier than I think many people realize.
Yeah, it began under Obama back in 2015. He issued this executive order, which honestly sounded kind of absurd at the time.
Declaring Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security.
An extraordinary threat. Yeah, that was the initial legal justification. But then Trump really tightened the screws. Starting around 2017, by 2019, it was a full economic embargo.
And they weren't subtle about the goal, were they? I remember that quote.
Oh yeah, the official bragging, it was like Darth Vader's death grip. It wasn't symbolic. It was a deliberate strategy to choke off the state's main income source.
Which had devastating consequences because Venezuela is such a classic petrostate. Its whole economy basically runs on oil revenue.
Exactly. Chavez used that revenue for everything: housing, healthcare, food subsidies, schools. So when oil prices crashed and then the embargo hit, boom, the state lost its funding overnight. Hyperinflation, economic collapse.
It sounds like the resource curse, the Dutch disease, but on steroids because of the sanctions.
Amplified massively by technology dependence. Here's the technical problem. Almost all of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, the refineries, the tech, it was originally built by U.S. companies.
Right.
And Venezuelan crude is really heavy, like tar. It needs lighter crude or special chemicals imported just to refine it into gasoline or other products.
So that was the weak spot. The sanctions meant they couldn't import that light crude.
Or spare parts. Exactly. No light crude, no spare parts, no equipment for maintenance, can't fix a refinery, can't upgrade anything. The whole system was basically engineered to collapse from the outside.
And this led to seizing assets, too. You hear about the Russian assets being frozen, but this happened to Venezuela first.
Way first. People talk about the $300 billion in Russian assets frozen in 2022, but Venezuela was the precedent. There's still, right now, $3 billion in Venezuelan gold sitting in the Bank of England.
And they won't give it back.
Nope. Repeatedly refused to return it. So freezing Russia's assets was an escalation, sure, but the playbook was tested on Venezuela. Some sources even call it international piracy.
But here's a twist, right?
Yeah.
Despite all this pressure, Venezuela has managed to get some oil production back online.
How?
Through Iran, interestingly enough.
Iran. How does that work?
Well, think about it. Iran's been under heavy U.S. sanctions since 1979. They were forced to innovate, to develop their own oil technology, their own parts, their own engineering know-how, completely outside the Western system. So decades of U.S. pressure on Iran accidentally created the solution for Venezuela.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? Iran now has the homegrown expertise in tech that Venezuela needs to start fixing and modernizing its own sanctioned infrastructure.
Okay, so if the economic pressure hasn't fully worked and they're finding workarounds like with Iran, what's the justification for, more direct action? You mentioned drug trafficking.
Right. The current U.S. legal narrative centers entirely on drug trafficking. U.S. courts have actually filed charges against President Maduro himself.
Alleging he's the head of a drug cartel.
Yeah, they claim he runs something called the Sun Cartel, El Cartel de los Soles.
Does this cartel actually exist?
Well, according to international investigators and drug experts cited in our sources, the consensus is no. They argue it was, quote, literally created by the U.S. as a political tool.
A pretext for intervention, like the WMD claims in Iraq.
That's the parallel being drawn. Fabricated justification links Saddam to al-Qaeda, link Maduro to a non-existent cartel to legitimize military action.
But charges filed in U.S. courts against a head of state. There must be something they're basing it on, even if it's thin. How do the sources counter that?
They point out the, let's say, profound irony. Neighboring Colombia, universally recognized by the UN and everyone else as the world's largest cocaine producer. And then there's the history. They bring up the documented cases of U.S. agencies themselves being involved in drug trafficking. Remember Gary Webb?
The journalist who exposed the CIA Contra cocaine connection in the 80s?
Exactly. He showed the CIA used cocaine money to fund the Contra War in Nicaragua. So there's historical precedent for intelligence agencies using the drug trade for geopolitical aims.
That context is definitely important. And if you look at the biggest drug crisis in the U.S. today,
Yeah.
it's not really cocaine from Latin America, is it?
No, it's fentanyl, the synthetic opioid epidemic. And the roots of that crisis are largely domestic. U.S. pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family.
Overprescribing OxyContin, leading to mass addiction.
Right. Which then fueled the market for illegal synthetics. So when you contrast the reality of the U.S. drug problem with this narrative focused on Venezuela's leadership, well, it makes the drug trafficking angle look pretty suspect as a primary reason for intervention.
So with all this pressure and this narrative building, where are we now in terms of actual military threat?
It feels like it's escalating. We've seen U.S. Navy ships operating closer to Venezuelan waters, and former President Trump even confirmed publicly that he'd authorized the CIA to run covert ops targeting Maduro directly.
Covert ops. That definitely pushes things towards potential conflict.
It really does. And the nightmare scenario here, if there was a military intervention or, say, Maduro was assassinated, is civil war.
Like Libya.
Exactly like Libya. NATO intervenes in 2011, takes out Gaddafi, destroys the central government, and 14 years later, the country is still a failed state, torn apart by conflict. That could easily happen in Venezuela.
Which would destabilize the entire region.
Massively. And yet, despite that risk, and despite the long, long history of U.S. interventions in Latin America.
You said they've intervened everywhere except French Guiana.
Pretty much. Despite all that, the region doesn't seem likely to unite against the U.S. on this.
Why not? What's stopping them?
Two main things, really. Fear and economic division. Countries are genuinely scared of being the next Venezuela.
Scared of those crippling sanctions, the asset freezes we talked about.
Absolutely. And economically, even though China's the biggest trade partner for many, the U.S. is still the gatekeeper to the global financial system. Losing access to the dollar, getting hit with secondary sanctions.
Or being cut off from SWIFT, that banking communication network.
Exactly. If you're cut off from SWIFT, you basically can't do international business. It's financial exile. And the U.S. holds the keys to that system, including correspondent banking.
So the economic leverage is just immense.
It is. And even among countries you might think would stick together, like the left-leaning bloc, there's fragmentation. It allows for that classic divide and conquer.
Like with the BRICS application. Venezuela wanted to join.
Yeah, Venezuela applied to join BRICS. You know, the bloc with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanding. Everyone was apparently on board, except one.
Who blocked it?
Brazil, led by Lula, a leftist president. But Brazil boycotted Venezuela's entry at the Kazan summit in 2024.
Why would Brazil do that?
Well, despite Lula's politics, Brazil has huge internal financial interests, massive export markets. It's still deeply tied to the U.S. financial system. Blocking Venezuela seems like it was a signal.
Prioritizing financial access over ideological solidarity.
That's how it looks. It effectively prevents a united South American front from forming to defend Venezuela's sovereignty.
So let's try to sum this up. Venezuela seems to be this convergence point. The world's biggest oil reserves, a history of nationalization challenging Western companies, the huge U.S.-China competition playing out, and this long history of intervention.
Right. And the actual fight seems to be about who controls those resources, who gets to decide Venezuela's future. But it's masked by these, frankly, questionable claims about drug trafficking and democracy promotion.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive here.
Yeah.
It really brings us back to where we started, with María Corina Machado.
Yeah, and here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. The very people, like Machado, who are calling for U.S. military intervention, calling for war, they're the ones getting nominated for things like the Nobel Peace Prize.
Quite a contrast.
It raises a really important question, doesn't it? In today's geopolitics, you have to wonder if sometimes these big international awards, like the Nobel Peace Prize, are used less to reward actual peacemaking.
And more as a political signal.
Yeah, maybe more as a highly politicized green light from the international community to support regime change. Something to think about.